Welcome to Heart of the West, where every mark tells a tale. A desperate rancher arrived seeking a horse, but when a young woman in tatters whispered, "Choose me instead," his world changed forever. Montana wilderness, dying days of winter, 1886, bitter. Wind screamed across Blackthorn Hollow, clawing at the weathered timber of the ancient trading post like some wounded beast. Ice covered the earth in jagged patches, while the mud below had hardened into something that shattered beneath footsteps like fragile pottery. Eli McCabe climbed down warily from his mule, the exhausted creature panting in short gasps, its hooves thick with frozen dirt. His threadbare coat, mended countless times at the shoulders, whipped around his boots as he crossed the yard, eyes squinting against the brutal cold. Company wasn't what drew him here. Neither was comfort. What he needed was a horse, any animal, strong enough to drag his family's crumbling legacy back from the brink of destruction. The trading post's interior reeked of harsh scents, rot-gut whiskey, harsh lye, and ancient pelts. Eli spoke sparingly, bartering for grain and salted meat before trailing the weathered proprietor toward the livestock pens out back. "Pickings are slim," the owner muttered, wrestling with a frozen latch using fingers cracked from cold. "Better animals before the blizzard hit, but desperation's cleaned me out. Just a few barely trained geldings and one worn-out sorrel. Nothing much for heavy work," Eli acknowledged with a nod, stepping through the gate while surveying the enclosures with the measured wariness of someone who'd witnessed death by both violence and hunger. His attention moved across the horses, too gaunt, too injured, too wild, and he prepared to depart. That's when he spotted her, not among the horses where she belonged. She sat tethered by a corroded iron chain wrapped around her ankle, its other end secured to a decaying fence post. A human soul, dressed in little more than burlap, her garment torn and barely reaching her knees, bare legs blue from the freezing air. Her hair fell in tangled masses across her face, and her hands showed the raw damage of endless exposure. She occupied a stall designed for animals. When their eyes met, Eli went rigid. Her gaze held the color of Riverstone's pale gray, luminous and vast, carrying not fear itself, but its haunting echo. Her mouth quivered before opening. "Choose me instead." Her voice came as barely a whisper against the wind. "I'm capable of labor. I can prepare meals. I won't flee." He remained speechless. For what felt like an eternity, he simply observed. The sounds of groaning timber and restless animals in the distance dissolved. Nothing remained except her plea, the chain, and the expression in her eyes that spoke of previous begging that had fallen on deaf ears. The trader's voice cut through from behind. "She's not available for purchase. Property of some fellow from the Hollow. Traded her for a pair of bottles and some opium. Relative of some sort, I believe." Eli turned deliberately. "What's his identity?" The trader shrugged dismissively. "Never inquired. Didn't matter. Said he'd return in 3 days. That was 6 ago. Eli moved closer, boots crushing the frozen ground. The girl didn't recoil. She stood as someone who'd endured too many blows to fear another. He knelt down, examining the rusted restraint. It wasn't even secured, just wrapped multiple times. Any child could have broken it with a stone. Yet she remained. "You had the chance to escape," he observed. She nodded slightly. "I understand. But I stayed." "Why?" Her throat moved as she swallowed hard. "No destination awaited me." Eli rose, facing the trader. "Your price for the old horse and her?" The man spat. "What in blazes would you need her for?" Eli offered no explanation. The trader's eyes narrowed. $20 for the nag and hell. Throw in that rifle of yours." Eli reached behind his back, unbuckling the Winchester from its position. He laid it across the fence without hesitation. The trader grunted, produced a blade, and severed the rope. "She belongs to you now." "Heaven help you both." The girl remained motionless initially. Then Eli offered his gloved hand. She stared at it, at the space between her chest and his palm, and something fractured inside her. "My name is Juniper," she breathed. He acknowledged with a nod. "Eli." She accepted his hand. It wasn't the hand of someone who rescued. It belonged to a man who'd laid his brother to rest, dug graves in frozen earth, and built barriers alone until his fingers bled. But it held steady, and for the first time in ages, Juniper moved forward. Rather than shrinking away, Eli never glanced back as they walked toward the sled. He couldn't look back, knowing that if he'd abandoned her in that stall, he would never have been able to face his reflection again. The journey home stretched long and bitter. Juniper sat stiffly on the sled, hands buried deep within her ragged coat gripping the fabric as if it were protective armor. Snow fell in gentle waves, settling in her hair. Yet she didn't flinch. She'd mastered the art of stillness, of becoming invisible. Eli guided them in silence, shoulders hunched against the wind, gaze locked on the path weaving through the forest. He didn't speak. He didn't turn around. And for that, Juniper felt oddly thankful. Each time the sled struck a bump and her body shifted nearer to his, her muscles tensed. She dared not meet his gaze. She understood men's intentions when they believed no one would intervene. Her stepfather had ensured she learned that lesson well. All men are identical, he'd snarl, whiskey heavy on his breath and fury blazing in his eyes. You'll discover that truth. Those words echoed with every breath of pine-scented air. When they reached the ranch, twilight had painted the peaks in deep purple and charcoal gray. The house stood modest but sturdy, weathered pine boards, a chimney sending smoke into the steel-colored sky, and a stable where a lone horse whinnied at their arrival. Eli dismounted first, securing the mule. Then he turned and extended his hand. Juniper stared at it without moving. He didn't force the issue. Instead, he walked to the entrance, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The fire crackled softly from within. She followed slowly, clutching her sleeves tightly. The warmth struck her like a physical force. Inside, the cabin was humble yet tidy: a wooden table, a small stove, shelves holding jars of beans and flour, a single bed against the wall, and beside it, surprisingly, another smaller bed, freshly prepared with a folded quilt at its foot. Eli spoke, his voice gravelly but gentle. "That's yours." Juniper blinked in surprise. He moved past her, lifted the kettle's lid, and stirred whatever simmered inside. She stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He spooned soup into a dented tin bowl and placed it on the table. Then he served himself the same way. No conversation, no permission requested. He sat down carefully, spine straight, spoon gripped like a defensive weapon. Her eyes darted to him, then away. What were his intentions? When would it start? But Eli simply sat, eating quietly, his attention on the flames rather than her. She couldn't trust it, wouldn't allow herself to. After the meal, she pulled her coat closer, wrapping herself like a specter. Her body remained braced for touches that never materialized. Eli stood, added another log to the fire, then turned to her. "Nobody claims what isn't freely given," he said quietly, "and you belong to no one." Juniper's breath caught. She stared at him. He didn't smile, didn't approach, just walked to his bed and lay down facing the wall. She sat for an extended time, hands frozen around her empty bowl's rim. Her heart raced, her stomach churned with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not exactly. She rose, walked to the corner where the other bed waited, and perched on its edge. Her body trembled not from cold, but from memory. From years of being regarded as something to be purchased, possessed, destroyed. Tears came silently. She buried her face in the quilt, too frightened to sob audibly, yet unable to stop the wet. Shaking. For the first time in years, someone had established a boundary. Not a threat, not a demand, but a clear line drawn in the snow. Juniper wept until the fire dimmed and her breathing slowed. Still, he didn't approach. He didn't watch her. He simply allowed her to exist. And for the first time, she began to believe perhaps she wasn't something ruined. Perhaps she remained someone worth protecting. The snow never completely ceased. Some mornings it arrived soft as a whisper. Other days it screamed in sheets across the ridge. But it persisted, a white, endless presence coating the roof, the fields, the fence rails. And somehow, between the cold and the quiet, Juniper began to truly live again. There existed no rigid schedule, no barked commands, no spoken contracts, just days connected by labor and warmth, and moments that wove themselves into something resembling peace. Eli demonstrated how to stack kindling, how to coax flames from damp tinder without smothering them. He taught her to strain broth, mend leather gear when stirrups cracked, shovel manure without retching. She learned to carry water without spilling, chop vegetables even when her hands shook, and sweep floors until every corner gleamed. He never inquired about her origins, never questioned what that ankle chain had represented. In return, she didn't ask about the scar across his collarbone or why his gaze lingered on the mountains long after the sun disappeared behind them. They shared space like ancient wolves, cautious, distant, yet somehow inseparable. If she dozed near the fire, he'd cover her with a blanket without disturbing her sleep. If he returned late from checking traps, she'd set aside warm stew for him. They alternated stoking the midnight fire, refilling water basins, securing doors against wind, and worse threats. One evening, Juniper awakened to sounds from outside. It was late, nearly midnight, with the moon hanging low behind clouds. Through the frosted window, she saw him kneeling in the snow near a cluster of pine trees. He held something in his hands, old, faded, familiar. She crept to the door soundlessly. It was a hat, frayed at the brim, collapsed at the crown. A boy's hat. Eli dug a shallow grave with bare hands, knuckles raw and movements deliberate. He placed the hat inside, then sat back on his heels. His shoulders rose and fell once, then again. She couldn't see his face, but his posture spoke volumes. He remained there extensively, simply breathing. Then he stood and walked back toward the cabin. Juniper stepped away from the door before he could notice her. The following morning, she said nothing. Just before breakfast, she stepped outside with a cup of water and walked barefoot across the snow. The cold bit her skin, but she didn't care. She found the small mound where snow had been disturbed and laid a single branch of dry mountain pine. Upon it, green, sparse, and fragrant. That night he discovered it. Eli stood by the mound for nearly 15 minutes. He didn't bend down, didn't touch the pine. He only observed. When he came inside, he remained silent. But the next morning, he handed her new socks, wool, thick, patched, handmade, not purchased. Juniper understood their meaning. She didn't need to explain the pine branch, and he didn't need to thank her for it. That was their way of living. Through gestures, through silences that conveyed more than confessions, through firewood divided equally, through how he always left a second spoon by the pot, through how she swept not only the floor but also the boots by the door, and slowly, without permission, the cabin transformed into something beyond mere shelter. It became theirs. A storm descended from the hills like a malediction, sweeping across the valley with a howl that sounded almost human. Wind tore through trees, bending pines until they snapped like bones. Snow devoured everything, sky, fences, even barn walls, until the world became a shifting blur of white blindness. Eli McCabe had witnessed war, seen winter's death consume men with steadier hands than rifles ever possessed. But even he cursed under his breath while dragging tarps over the woodpile, battling gusts that nearly toppled him. The horses were panicked, kicking at their stalls, eyes wide with wild terror. He moved from gate to gate, securing each latch with frostbitten fingers. Then came the cry. It wasn't loud over the wind, but it carried high and sharp, desperate like a broken hinge, a loose plank. One of the young mares, the skittish bay they'd recently begun training, had bolted. Snow kicked up behind her fleeing form like steam from a cannon blast. Before Eli could even shout, he saw Juniper barefoot, coat flying open, hair a tangle of dark fire in the wind. "Juniper," he roared. But the storm seized his voice, tearing it to pieces before it could reach her. She ran with a kind of reckless courage that made his chest constrict with something beyond fear. She found the mare near the ravine's edge, where the snowbank dropped dangerously. The horse's leg was trapped in the twisted roots of a frozen shrub, its nostrils flaring with terror. Juniper dropped to her knees in the snow, whispering soft reassurances to calm the animal, pressing her body against its flank as if to shield it from the storm. Her hands bled where branches scratched her. Her breath came in sobs, but she persisted until the hoof was freed and the horse could limp forward. By the time Eli reached them, both girl and animal were coated in ice. She collapsed before they reached the barn. He caught her mid-fall, lifting her into his arms with a shout that echoed uselessly into the wind. Inside the cabin, he moved with a ferocity born from something deeper than panic. He stripped the soaked dress from her shivering body, wrapping her in every quilt and blanket he owned. He built the fire high until it roared. Herbs were boiled, mint, willow bark, and the last of his fever root supply. He mashed the roots with bare hands, not caring when they stained his palms brown. Warm cloths were pressed to her skin. Broth was spooned between chattering lips. Juniper burned with fever for 2 days. Eli never left her side. When her lips cracked, he touched them with honey on a ragged fingertip. When her body curled against invisible pain, he sat beside her, holding her hand not tightly, but firmly, like an anchor. He didn't pray to God. He no longer believed in that, but he watched her chest rise and fall, counting each breath like a man who'd seen too many stolen. Then, at the quiet edge of the third dawn, Juniper opened her eyes. The fire had died low. Snow whispered against the window panes. Eli sat slumped in the chair beside her bed, head bowed, eyes closed, hands still wrapped gently around hers. She stared at that hand, large, scarred, still. He hadn't released. Her voice, when it emerged, was dry as paper. "Why did you truly bring me here?" Eli stirred. His eyes opened slowly, sleep still clinging to the edges. He looked at her, not surprised, not hesitant, just present. "Because," he said, his voice rough but quiet, "something told me you weren't finished being alive yet. No grand speech, no poetic reasoning. Just that." Juniper blinked. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes and slipped down her cheeks into the wool pillow. They weren't loud tears, not shaking ones, but deep, silent, the kind that come when someone finally voices what your heart never dared believe. He thought she was still worth saving, still worth living for. He rose, stoked the fire, and set another pot of herbs to boil. No more words, no request for gratitude, just care. Juniper turned her face aside, listening to the sounds of morning. The storm outside was passing, and something in her chest, something long buried, had begun to thaw. The sky was slate gray when the hoofbeats came. Sloppy, uneven, drunk with mud. Juniper was inside folding clean linens near the hearth. When she heard it, that sound, that rhythm, her hands froze. She moved to the window, heart already racing, and looked out. He was there, her stepfather. Thomas Clay, drunk, filthy, slouched in the saddle like a sack of meat and rage. His coat was torn, his face half covered in frost and madness. The bottle in his hand sloshed as he rode straight up to the fence, yelling loud enough to wake the dead. "You've got someone of mine, ranch boy," he bellowed. "Send her out. That little wretch doesn't get to hide behind your cow fences and lies." Juniper backed away from the window. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Eli was in the barn. She ran to the door but couldn't speak, her throat locked, her body remembering too much. Outside, Thomas dismounted unsteadily and stumbled toward the cabin. "You hear me?" he screamed. "You stole what isn't yours. She's mine. I fed her, clothed her. She owes me." The front door swung open before he reached the steps. Eli stood there, rifle in hand, calm as stone. "You're not welcome here," he said. Thomas squinted. "That her? Hiding in there like she's got value. You think you're her savior, huh?" He took a step forward. Eli raised the rifle slow, steady, and pointed it directly at Thomas Clay's forehead. "You touch her, you bleed," he said. "You speak her name, you die." Thomas blinked, then laughed a jagged, broken sound. "She's mine," he shouted, pulling a knife from his coat. The shot rang out so fast it seemed to split the wind. Thomas screamed, dropped to the snow, clutching his leg. Juniper crouched behind the door, covered her ears, but didn't cry. Eli walked forward, grabbed Thomas by the collar, and dragged him through the snow like a sack of rot. The older man swung once wildly, but Eli dodged it and knocked him unconscious with the rifle butt. One clean blow, efficient, final. The silence afterward was thick and wide. Juniper stepped out of the cabin barefoot. She watched as Eli tied the man's hands, slung him over the horse like a broken sack, then walked to the fence post by the gate. There, with a piece of charcoal and an old board, he wrote in jagged, heavy strokes, "No one owns anyone." He nailed it to the gate. Then he turned to Juniper. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. He didn't reach for her. He just nodded. "I'll ride him to town," he said quietly. "He won't be back." Juniper stood straighter. Something in her chest shifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was watching her past be carried away by the same road that had once brought her pain, and beside her stood a man who ensured it never would again. The night was long and windless. No snow fell. No coyotes howled. The cabin stood like a lone ember in a sea of black woods, warmed only by the soft crackle of fire and the hush of two people who sat too close to call it distance, too quiet to call it peace. Juniper curled her legs beneath her on the old quilt-draped bench, a mug of broth resting in her hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, but her thoughts stayed cold, old echoes still drifting like frost on the edges of memory. The firelight flickered across her face, catching in her lashes, casting shadows beneath her eyes no longer hollow, but still cautious. Eli sat across from her, elbows on his knees, jaw tight. He stared into the flames like a man trying to read the language of smoke, searching for something he'd lost long ago. The lines in his brow deepened with every Pop of the cedar log. It was Juniper who spoke first, her voice so soft it could have been mistaken for the fire settling. Do you want to know what I thought that first night? He didn't move, but he looked at her. His silence said yes. I thought about running, she said. Even barefoot, even through snow just away. She gave a small, dry laugh, bitter at the edges, hollow in the middle, because I didn't believe there were men who gave without asking. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. Eli swallowed hard but still said nothing. She looked down at her mug, then out past the window where the dark pressed up against the glass. I even tried once. Before you, there was a bridge near she paused, near the place I was kept. It wasn't high just enough. Her voice caught there, but she didn't stop. I stood there for hours, cold, shaking, but I didn't jump. She stared into the steam rising from her cup, fingers clenched. Do you know why? Eli waited, still as stone, because I thought even death might not want me, might spit me out. I was already too used up, too filthy. What was the point of dying if I wasn't even worth that? Her words floated out and settled between them like ash. She wasn't crying. Not really. Her eyes were wet, but it was like the tears belonged to someone else, someone younger, someone who hadn't learned how to build walls out of silence. Eli's hand tightened around the armrest. Then, slowly, like it hurt to do it, he reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out a thin chain. At the end hung a bullet, flattened, dark, its grooves scarred with years. This one's right here, he said, tapping just beneath his ribs. Vicksburg, Union lines. My brother shoved me behind a barrel, took the second bullet, died right there in the mud. Juniper didn't speak. She didn't move. She only listened. I stayed, Eli said. Part of me didn't want to. I thought maybe I was supposed to go with him. We always said we'd ride home together, or not at all. His voice had gone hoarse by then, but he kept his eyes on the fire as if afraid they'd betray more than he could afford to give. The silence between them grew dense. Then Juniper's voice, fragile but firm. But you didn't. No, Eli said. I didn't. He opened his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, calloused, steady, patient. Then, like it was the most terrifying thing she'd ever done, she reached out and set her hand in his. Their fingers didn't tangle. They simply rested together, skin against skin, warm and quiet. It was the first time they had touched without fear. Eli's thumb brushed the back of her hand. Her breath hitched sharp, unfamiliar. You're not broken, he said, his voice rough as gravel but steady. And even if you were, I'd still want you here. Juniper blinked fast, not because of tears, but because her body didn't know what to do with this kind of kindness. He wasn't trying to fix her. He was staying. He saw the cracks and he stayed. Her shoulders shifted, tilting ever so slightly toward him. Not for warmth, not for safety, but because she wanted to. She wanted to be held not like a possession or a project or a prize, but like someone understood. Eli moved slowly, his arm coming around her shoulders, drawing her close in a way that asked nothing, promised only presence. She rested her head beneath his chin, and they sat that way for a long time. The fire kept burning low and steady. They were not healed, but they were here together, and for now, that was everything. The snow melted in threads, not rivers. First, the drips from the eaves, then the softening of the earth beneath Eli's boots. By the end of March, patches of green pushed up between stones, stubborn and small, but unmistakably alive. Juniper woke one morning to the sound of birds. Real birds, not crows or hawks, but the trill of a meadowlark. It made her sit up in bed, heart oddly full, as if the song had been meant just for her. By midday, she was outside helping Eli hammer the frame for a new corral. The old one had collapsed under the weight of the storm, like so many things that winter. Now, in the crisp, thawed light, they built again. Juniper wore one of Eli's shirts tied at the waist. Her hair, longer now, swayed in the wind, no longer matted or hidden beneath rags. Dirt smudged her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. He watched her work, not to supervise, not out of suspicion, but with a quiet respect that only comes from having seen someone rise from near ruin and choose, again and again, to stay upright. She learned to ride that week. It was Eli's idea. Every person should know how to move through this land on their own terms, he said, and she had nodded, though fear curled in her gut. But when she mounted the brown mare, her knees trembling, he stood beside her with one hand on the saddle. Horn, eyes calm, voice steady. You don't have to run anymore, he said. But if you ever want to, I want you to know how to run your way. She rode 10 feet that day, then 20. By the end of the week, she circled the pasture and laughed for the first time since she had come to the ranch. Eli left for town a few days later. "Supplies," he said. Juniper offered to go, but he shook his head. "Let me bring you something back," he said. "Something that isn't food or firewood." He returned the next afternoon, dust on his coat and something wrapped in flannel tucked inside his pocket. He didn't hand it to her right away. He waited until sunset when they stood on the ridge behind the cabin, overlooking the pasture now glowing gold with new grass. Then he pulled out the bundle and placed it gently in her hands. She unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside was a silver hair comb, simple, elegant, etched with tiny wildflowers along the edge, worn in places but still gleaming. Juniper stared. She had never owned anything pretty, never owned much of anything that hadn't come from someone else's want or filth. "I saw it in the general store," Eli said, voice rougher than usual. "It isn't new, but it's free. It's yours. No one ever paid for it with you." Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The silver felt cool against her skin. She turned away slightly, ran the comb through her hair, and tucked a lock behind her ear. Then she looked at him. "I've never belonged to anything good," she whispered. Until now, Eli didn't answer. He only looked at her with that same stillness, the kind that steadied storms. Together they stood as the sun dropped behind the mountains, casting long shadows and golden light across the land. They didn't speak again that evening, but they didn't need to. The spring wind came softer now, less bite, more whisper. Wildflowers crept across the pasture like someone had spilled color across the earth on purpose. The fence posts had all been replaced. The cabin roof no longer leaked, and inside, laughter sometimes echoed between the walls. One afternoon, while Juniper was trading eggs for flour at the edge of the road, a traveling peddler squinted at her. "Ain't you the girl from last winter?" he asked, voice loud and thoughtless. "The one who was chained up behind the stock pens. Sold for a bottle," they said. Juniper flinched, not out of shame, but out of memory, that old cold sting. Eli was tying down sacks of grain nearby. He looked up slow and calm and spoke before she could. "She was," he said, voice steady as stone. "Now she's my wife." The man blinked, muttered something, and walked off. Juniper stared at Eli. He didn't look at her, just kept tying the rope, firm and sure, like he had simply stated a fact of the world. That night, under the tall cypress near the hill behind the barn, they were married. No preacher, no witnesses, just Juniper in a dress she had sewn from flour sacks, and Eli in his cleanest shirt, his hair combed back for once. They stood beneath branches laced with new green leaves, the sky above them streaked with lavender and gold. Juniper took his hand. "First, I don't have vows," she whispered. "Me neither," he said. "Just hands." They joined them. The horses watched from the fence line. The wind carried the scent of blooming sage and cedar. They kissed gentle, shy, like it was still new, still delicate, but not afraid. Afterward, back at the cabin, Juniper slipped inside and placed something on the hearth. A letter, folded clean, pressed flat, written in the quiet hours of her last night as a girl alone. Eli saw it but didn't touch it. She nodded toward it. "Read it when you want," she said, "or never." Later, while she was brushing her hair, he sat down and opened it. The ink was uneven, a little smudged at the corners, but the words were clear. "You didn't save me. You didn't rescue me. You stood still. You built something quiet and kind and strong, and kept it open until I stepped into it. You gave me space until I found myself worth saving. And now I want to build something with you. Not because I owe you, because I choose you." Eli read it twice. Then he folded the letter again and placed it behind the old stone on the mantel. That night he built a fire not because it was cold, but because the light made the room feel more like home. And when Juniper sat beside him, her head on his shoulder, her hand finding his, he knew something simple and eternal. This cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was home, tangible proof they were no longer two people trying to survive. They were a family born not from rescue, but from choosing to stay. Every day after, the fire still burned. But now it wasn't just for warmth. It was for beginning again. If your heart stopped when Eli raised his gun to protect Juniper, if you held your breath when she whispered "until now" and took that first step out of fear, then this was never just a love story. It was a story about worth, about choosing to be loved even after being broken. In a West no longer ruled by storms, they found each other not as saviors, but as home. If you believe in stories that heal, in glances stronger than words, and in hands that stay, then make sure to subscribe to Heart of the West Love Stories. Each week, we bring you timeless tales of love that rose from dust, bullets, and silence. And who knows, maybe the next story is the one your heart has been waiting for. Subscribe now, because some love stories deserve to be told beneath the firelight forever.